of whose talents, traditions, and achievements I am so inexpressibly proud, have prospered and flourished.
The monarchy has just been fundamentally rewritten. In a brief, chilling announcement from the King's private office, Prince George has been officially named the direct and sole successor to the throne, effectively barring the Queen's own children from any future claims or administrative roles within the royal hierarchy. The news has sent shockwaves through the estate, as the document explicitly strips away any lingering influence held by the Queen's family. With this sudden, ironclad declaration, the King has finally chosen his side, and the battle for the future of the house is over. The proclamation from Sandringham. The Privy Council chamber at Sandringham was drafty. A single fire burned in the grate. The light did not reach the corners of the room. The King stood at the head of the long table. He was holding a document with a heavy royal seal. His hands were steady. Around the table, 12 senior courtiers sat in silence. They were staring at the floor. The only sound was the wind against the leaded glass windows. The King adjusted his glasses and began to read. The facts are that this document changed the entire foundation of the house. It declared Prince George the direct and sole heir to the throne. It used specific new language to exclude any other branch of the family from future succession. The Queen's children were not mentioned by name. They were simply removed from the legal path of the crown. It was an administrative act of extreme surgical precision. The document was dated today, July 18, 2026. Tension filled the air as the King finished the reading. He reached for his pen. He did not ask for input from the council. He had already consulted with his legal team and the Duke of Kent. The document was final. He touched the nib of the pen to the paper. The scratch of the ink was the only noise in the chamber. He signed his name with a firm, black line. He laid the pen down on the mahogany table. The mystery was why the King chose this specific location. He could have made this announcement at Buckingham Palace. He could have used the traditional media channels. Instead, he chose the quiet of his private estate. He wanted this to be an internal act. He did not want a debate. He wanted the decision to be a reality before the public even knew it had happened. The mystery resolved when the King's secretary stood up. He walked to the side door. He opened it and revealed a team of official couriers. They were waiting to carry the signed copies to the relevant government offices. The King was ensuring that the legal status of the crown changed instantly. He had bypassed the usual slow process of royal updates. He was making sure the transition was protected by law. The facts were that the Queen's remaining staff in the building did not know what was happening. They were in the offices down the hall. They were still working on the old schedules. They had no idea that their legal standing in the house had just been erased. The King had effectively fired them all with a single signature. He was resetting the entire administration. A new mystery emerged when a courier walked out of the council chamber. He did not go to the main gate. He walked toward the stables. He was meeting a contact there. The King watched him go from the window. He was watching to see if his orders were being followed. He was not just signing a paper. He was directing a movement of people and resources. The King turned away from the window. He looked at the courtiers. He told them that their work for the day was finished. They stood up. They did not look at each other. They walked out of the room in a line. They were part of a new restricted circle. They knew that their lives were now governed by the rules on the paper. The Princess of Wales entered the room a moment later. She was wearing a simple coat. She looked at the desk. She saw the signed document. She did not show any outward emotion. She stood beside the King. They looked at the empty chairs. The room was cold. They were the architects of a new era. The King picked up the document. He handed it to her. She checked the seal. She nodded. She had played a key role in the drafting. She had worked with the lawyers to ensure the language was bulletproof. She was the one who had pushed for the exclusion of the other branches. She was the one who had secured the future for her son. The weight of the document was light, but the consequences were heavy. Thousands of pages of previous royal rules were now obsolete. The structure of the family tree had been pruned. She put the document back on the table. She looked at the King. She asked him if he was sure. He did not hesitate. He told her that it was the only way to save the monarchy. The fire in the grate flickered and died. The room grew colder. The King walked to the door. He paused to look back at the room. It was the place where he had finally asserted his authority. He was not the mediator anymore. He was the sovereign. He was the one who decided who mattered. They walked out into the hall. The palace was quiet. The staff was working in the background. They were the only ones who knew what had happened. They were the ones who would have to lead the country through the coming storm. The announcement would be made to the public in the morning. They had until then to prepare. The princess felt a sense of resolve. She had spent weeks fighting for this outcome. She had risked her standing and her safety. She had faced the queen and her loyalists. Now she was standing on the other side of the fire. She was the mother of the future king. She was the guardian of the new rules. She was ready. The exclusion of the queen's children. The administrative office at Sandringham was a cramped, utilitarian space. It felt nothing like the grand, carpeted halls of the palace. Boxes of files were stacked against the walls. A printer hummed in the corner. The king's legal counsel sat at a desk, reviewing a series of red-bound folders. He was checking the final wording of the new succession decree. He reached for a stamp. He pressed it onto the bottom of the page. The ink was thick and dark. The facts are that the new decree did more than just name Prince George as the heir. It used specific exclusionary language to strip the Queen's children of their administrative standing. They were no longer eligible for any role in the management of the royal estates. They were no longer entitled to participate in the Council of Regency. Their names were removed from the succession line entirely. It was a complete legal separation. The decree was designed to ensure that the Queen's family could never again influence the governance of the monarchy. Tension built as the Queen's private secretary entered the room. He had been sent to collect the daily briefings. He stopped when he saw the red-bound folders. He recognized the seal. He knew that the status of his employers had changed. He did not ask what was in the folders. He knew the answer. He stood at the door. He was waiting for a signal of what he should do next. The mystery was how the Queen's children would receive the news. None of them were currently at the estate. Some were in London. One was traveling abroad. They had no idea that their legal position had been revoked. The king had insisted that the notification be delivered through official channels only after the decree was filed. He wanted no chance for them to preempt the announcement with their own legal challenges. The mystery resolved when a courier service was dispatched to each of their homes. Each person received a single, thick envelope. It contained a copy of the signed decree and a note from the king's office. The note was brief. It stated that the transition was effective immediately. It did not offer a meeting. It did not offer an explanation. It was a final bureaucratic ending to their connection with the core of the monarchy. The facts were that the reaction from the Queen's children was immediate and sharp. One of them called the king's secretary. He shouted. He demanded to know how the king could justify such a radical change without a public vote. The secretary was instructed to say nothing. He simply listened to the complaints and then hung up the phone. The king was no longer engaging in the debate. He was moving forward. A new mystery emerged in the hours following the delivery of the notices. Where were the Queen's children now gathering? A fleet of private cars was spotted leaving the city. They were headed toward a secluded estate in the countryside. The security detail outside the king's office reported that they were likely planning a joint legal response. They were not going to accept the exclusion without a fight. The king stood in his study. He watched the cars pull out onto the main road. He knew what they were doing. He turned to the Princess of Wales. She was standing by the bookshelf. She was holding a map of the royal lands. She told him that the property rights of the Queen's children were also being reviewed. She said that they would have to vacate their official residences by the end of the month. The king nodded. He was not surprised by the escalation. He had expected it. He told her to prepare the eviction notices. He wanted to be sure that there was no physical presence left for them to hold on to. He was clearing the house from the top to the bottom. He was ensuring that his son's inheritance was clear of any outside claim. The princess walked to the desk. She looked at the draft of the eviction notice. She added a clause about the return of all royal keys and security codes. She wanted the separation to be total. She wanted there to be no lingering access to the private information of the house. The king watched her work. He realized that she was more efficient than he had ever been. The night air was still. The palace felt empty. The Queen's children were on their way to their meeting. They were preparing a challenge that would never reach the light of day. The king had moved too fast for them. He had the law on his side. He had the support of the Duke of Kent. He had the future of his sons secured. The king sat at his desk. He looked at the family photo on the wall. He saw his grandson. He realized that he would never have to deal with the infighting that had defined his own reign. He had created a path of silence. He had created a path of order. He felt the weight of the throne. It was finally a weight he could carry on his own. The house was ready for the morning. The decree would be announced at noon. The press was already camping at the gate. They had no idea what was inside the folders. They had no idea that the monarchy had just been changed by a few lines of text. The king stood up. He walked to the window. He was the king. He was ready. Prince George's new reality. Prince George sat on the edge of a mahogany desk in his tutor's study. He was looking at a map of the royal estates. His security detail stood by the door. There were 2 new men in the room today. They were dressed in plain clothes. They did not speak to him. They did not interact with his tutor. They stood with their hands behind their backs. They were watching the window. They were watching the hallway. They were watching the prince. The facts are that the security arrangement for Prince George has been entirely overhauled since the announcement at Sandringham. He is no longer just a royal child living in the household. He is the official heir to the throne. His protection protocol is now identical to that of the king. He has a permanent detail that follows him from room to room. He has a secure communication line. He has a designated emergency vehicle that is kept running at all times. Tension flared when the prince asked one of the guards for his name. The guard looked at him. He did not smile. He told him that he was only allowed to provide his call sign. The prince felt the change in the room. He was not a boy playing in the gardens anymore. He was a piece of high-value property. He looked back at the map. He did not ask any more questions. The mystery was why the king insisted on such an extreme level of protection for an 11-year-old. The palace had never before isolated a child in this way. Some of the staff whispered that there had been specific, credible threats intercepted by the security team. They said that the exclusion of the queen's children had made the prince a target for anyone looking to disrupt the transition. The mystery resolved when the king entered the study. He walked to the window. He checked the line of sight from the nearby trees. He spoke to the guards. He did not acknowledge the prince until the security check was complete. He turned to the boy. He told him that he had to be ready for the new life. He explained that his safety was the only thing standing between the monarchy and collapse. The facts were that the prince's daily schedule was also changed. He no longer walked to the stables alone. He no longer had lunch with the other children of the palace staff. His meals were checked by a security officer before he was allowed to eat them. His lessons were held in rooms that had been swept for listening devices. He was the most protected person in the country. He was also the most confined. A new mystery opened when a tutor from the University of Cambridge arrived. He was a specialist in constitutional law. He was not there to teach history or math. He was there to teach the prince about the legal mechanisms of the throne. Why was the boy being forced to learn such complex material? He was only 11 years old. The palace teachers were worried about the pressure. The king sat at the table with them. He watched as the prince tried to grasp the concept of absolute sovereignty. The boy looked tired. The king did not care. He pushed him to memorize the clauses. He wanted the prince to be able to recite the laws of succession by heart. He was preparing him to defend his position against the legal challenges that were expected to come. The security guard signaled the king. It was time for the next part of the schedule. The prince stood up. He walked toward the door. The 2 men followed him. They walked a step behind him. They were invisible, yet they were everywhere. The prince did not look back. He had learned his first lesson of being the heir. He did not belong to himself anymore. The hallways were long and quiet. They walked toward the private garden. This was the only place where he was allowed to spend time outside. Even here, the fence was lined with sensors. The guards stayed by the trees. They were watching the sky for drones. The prince walked to the fountain. He sat on the edge. He picked up a stone and skipped it across the water. He thought about the life he had before the announcement. He had played football in the yard. He had been allowed to leave the gates with a single guard. Now, everything was measured. Everything was signed for. He felt the weight of the crown on his small shoulders. He looked at the guards. They were staring into the distance. They were ready to die for him. The king watched from the upstairs balcony. He saw his grandson alone at the fountain. He felt a moment of pity, but he pushed it away. He knew that the monarchy could not afford a weak successor. He had to be strong. He had to be knowledgeable. He had to be ready to step into the role at a moment's notice. The prince was the future. The sun began to set. The garden was casting long shadows. The guards moved closer. The prince stood up. He turned and headed back to the house. He did not say a word. He went to his room to finish his study of the law. The guards stood by the door. The night began. The prince was the heir. The palace was his cage. The palace purge. Removing the old guard. The staff corridors at Buckingham Palace were filled with the sound of rolling trunks. It was 2 a.m. A line of cars waited in the inner courtyard. They were not official palace vehicles. They were unmarked transports. Security officers stood at every junction in the hallway. They carried clipboards with lists of names. They checked each person against the paper before letting them pass through the security checkpoint. The facts are that the purge began exactly 4 hours after the decree was signed at Sandringham. The king had ordered a complete clearance of all staff members connected to the Queen's office. This included secretaries, administrative assistants, and long-serving logistics coordinators. They were given 60 minutes to pack their belongings. They were not allowed to take any documents or electronic devices. They were being stripped of their access to the heart of the monarchy. Tension spiked when the head of the Queen's kitchen staff refused to leave. He argued that he had served the house for 30 years. He said he had a contract that protected him from summary dismissal. The security officer did not argue. He simply pointed to a document on his clipboard. He told the man that the decree of succession superseded all previous employment agreements. He was escorted out of the service door by 2 guards. The mystery was how the king's new administration had identified all of the Queen's allies so quickly. Most of the staff had been hired through traditional channels. They were not all vocal supporters of her policies. Some were just workers who had done their jobs for decades. It seemed impossible for the king to have categorized every single person in the palace in such a short amount of time. The mystery resolved when a box of personnel files was seen being moved into the Princess of Wales' office. It was a complete, cross-referenced directory of every employee's loyalties and associations. It was not a new list. It had been compiled over several years of observation. The princess had been building this directory as part of her private study. She had known exactly who had to go from the very beginning. The facts were that the removal was total. By 4 a.m, the Queen's Old Guard had been completely cleared from the main administrative wing. Their offices were already being cleaned by a new team of staff. The new team was recruited from the households that had shown direct allegiance to the princess. The house was being restaffed with people who knew their primary duty was to the new heir and the king. A new mystery emerged as a small group of senior advisors remained in the building. They had not been included in the purge. They were the ones who had worked closely with the Queen for years. Why were they allowed to stay? Some observers wondered if they had secretly turned on the Queen to save their own careers. Others feared they were staying behind to act as a 5th column. The princess walked through the empty offices. She saw the new staff arranging the desks. They were working quickly. She felt a sense of satisfaction. The house was finally clean. She had identified the weak links. She had replaced them with people who understood the new order. She saw one of the remaining advisors standing by the window. She walked over to him. She told him that his position was under review. She did not promise him that he would stay. She wanted him to know that he was being watched. He nodded. He did not speak. He understood the game. He knew that his survival depended on his total cooperation. She left him there in the dark office. He was a relic of the past, living on borrowed time. The courtyard was nearly empty now. The last of the transport cars was pulling away. The palace was quiet. It was the quiet of a place that had been hollowed out and rebuilt. The king walked into the office wing. He saw the princess. They did not need to speak. They had succeeded. The purge was complete. The morning light began to touch the tops of the palace buildings. The city was waking up. People were going to work. They had no idea that the palace had undergone a revolution during the night. They were going to see a new team in the press office. They were going to see a new team in the royal household. The monarchy was moving into a new phase. The king looked out at the city. He felt the weight of the throne. He was the head of a house that had been purged of its history. He was the head of a house that was now entirely focused on the future. The prince was the heir. The princess was the architect. The monarchy was secure. The last of the keys were collected. The last of the badges were turned in. The palace was ready for the day. The staff continued their work. They were the new guardians of the order. They were the ones who would carry the legacy into the next century. The house was quiet. The house was ready. The noon announcement: a family divided. The clock on the wall of the palace press room struck 12. The red light on the main television camera turned on. The new press secretary stepped up to the wooden podium. He adjusted a stack of paper. He did not smile at the reporters gathered in the rows before him. He opened the folder. He began to read the official statement from the king. His voice was flat. The room was perfectly still. The facts are that the announcement went live across all national networks at noon on July 19, 2026. The statement confirmed the new letter's patent signed at Sandringham. It formally declared Prince George as the sole designated heir to the crown. It detailed the new administrative boundaries of the royal estates. It confirmed the removal of the Queen's children from the official list of working royals. The document was now public law. Tension inside the room grew as the secretary reached the final paragraph. He read a specific clause regarding the immediate freezing of several secondary royal accounts. The reporters began to whisper. They were typing quickly on their phones. The text of the announcement was hitting the news websites in real time. The phones at the back of the press office began to ring simultaneously. The staff did not answer them. The facts were that the government had already issued a brief statement of support. The Prime Minister had signed a neutrality agreement earlier in the morning. The legal basis for the king's action was secure. The Parliament would not debate the matter. The change was treated as an internal household reorganization. It was a clean execution of legal power. The mystery was why the published text contained a blank space at the bottom of page 3. The official copies distributed to the press had a missing signature line. The document listed the names of all privy councillors present at Sandringham. Yet, one name was clearly omitted from the final print. The reporters noticed the gap immediately. They began to shout questions at the podium. The mystery resolved when the Princess of Wales's office released a secondary memo 10 minutes later. The missing name belonged to the Chancellor of the Duchy. The princess had deliberately withheld his signature from the public version. She wanted to keep his position ambiguous. She was using the blank space to ensure his compliance with the next phase of the estate transfers. He had signed the master copy, but the public did not need to know that yet. A new mystery opened as the press conference ended. A private black helicopter was spotted taking off from the lawns of Windsor Castle. It was flying north toward the Scottish border. It did not have an official flight plan listed on the public registry. The radar tracking showed it was avoiding the usual military corridors. The princess watched the television screen in her private office. She saw the news reports about the helicopter. She turned to her chief of staff. She asked if the transport had been authorized by the king. The chief of staff shook his head. He said the flight had been ordered directly from the Queen's private quarters before the noon announcement went live. The facts were that the Queen was still inside Windsor Castle. She had not left her rooms all morning. She had refused to see the king's messengers. She had refused to sign the receipt for the new decree. The helicopter was carrying something out of the castle before the new security teams could lock down the perimeter. The princess picked up her phone. She called the security gate at the northern estate. She told the guards to prepare for an unscheduled arrival. She wanted to know exactly what was inside that helicopter when it landed. She knew the Queen was not giving up her assets without a final move. The city outside the palace was reacting to the news. Crowds were gathering near the main gates. The television analysts were discussing the exclusion of the Queen's children. They were calling it the biggest structural shift in 50 years. The public was confused by the speed of the events. They were trying to understand who was now in control. The king entered the princess's office. He looked at the television screen. He saw the images of the helicopter. He told her that the Queen's children had officially left their London residences. They had complied with the first part of the decree. They were now staying at a private farm in Gloucestershire. They had issued no statements to the press. The princess told the king about the missing signature on page 3. She explained that the Chancellor was now cooperating with the new asset team. The king nodded. He sat down in the armchair by the window. He looked tired but relieved. The public part of the work was done. The legal framework was functioning. The phone on the desk buzzed. It was the security team from the northern estate. The helicopter had landed. The guards had inspected the cargo. They reported that the transport was empty. It had carried no files and no valuables. It had only carried a single passenger. The passenger was the Queen's personal lawyer. He had left the castle before the noon announcement to file a countersuit in the Scottish courts. The Queen was bypassing the English legal system entirely. She was using an old territorial law to challenge the Sandringham decree. The princess stood up from her desk. She looked out the window at the palace courtyard. She realized the battle was not over. The purge of the old guard was complete, but the legal war was just beginning. She turned to the king. She told him to call the Duke of Kent back to the office. They needed a new strategy for the morning. The Princess of Wales's new authority. The desk in the princess's private office was covered in thick cream-colored paper. Each sheet was marked with a red wax stamp. She was sitting in a high-backed chair. She was holding a fountain pen. She was reviewing the latest property audit from the southern estates. The king entered the room. He did not knock. He walked to the window and looked out at the rain. He told her that the Scottish court had accepted the Queen's filing. The legal battle was now a matter of public record. The facts are that the princess had become the primary decision-maker for the entire transition. She was no longer just advising the king. She was signing the documents that moved millions of pounds of assets into the new trust. She was authorizing the dismissal of the old estate managers. She was the one who had successfully isolated the Queen's legal team from the primary decision-making council. She was running the house with a level of detail that had not been seen in decades. Tension filled the small office. The king asked her if she was ready for the hearing in Edinburgh. She looked up from the papers. She told him that she had already spoken to the judge. She had offered him a position on the new royal advisory board. She was not just waiting for the court to rule. She was ensuring the outcome before the case even started. The king looked at her. He saw the cold efficiency in her eyes. He nodded. The mystery was how she had managed to get a meeting with a sitting judge. The judicial process was supposed to be independent of the monarchy. The palace could not just influence court outcomes. The media would have a field day if they found out that the princess was in contact with the judge presiding over the Queen's case. The mystery resolved when the princess opened a locked drawer in her desk. She pulled out a file. It contained a series of private transactions between the judge's family firm and the royal accounts. The judge was not an ally. He was a man who owed his current business success to the financial support of the palace. He was not making a decision based on the law. He was protecting his own history. The facts were that the princess was now leveraging every piece of information she had gathered during her private study. She was not using force. She was using the existing structure of debt and loyalty. She had mapped the relationships between every judge, every advisor, and every legal counselor in the country. She was playing a game of chess while the Queen's children were still trying to understand the rules of the board. A new mystery emerged as she looked at a name on the audit list. It was a person she thought she had already removed from the payroll. Why was the Chancellor still authorizing payments to this individual? She traced the account number back through the ledger. It was a ghost account. It had been set up to channel funds to an unknown party in Switzerland. She realized that the Queen had one more line of money that she had not been able to find. The princess stood up. She walked to the wall map of the estates. She looked at the location of the bank in Geneva. She realized that the Queen had been moving the liquid assets of the crown into private holdings for years. This was why the Queen had been so calm during the banquet. She was not just relying on the tradition of the house. She was planning for a life outside of it. She called for the security chief. She told him to prepare a transport for Switzerland. She did not tell the king. She needed to go there herself. She needed to see the person who was managing the accounts. She needed to freeze the money before the court case in Scotland could move forward. She grabbed her coat. She did not stop to say goodbye to the king. The drive to the airfield was silent. The city lights were a blur. She looked at her phone. She was tracking the transfers. The money was moving in small increments. It was a well-planned exit strategy. She was impressed by the foresight. The Queen was a true strategist. But she was not going to win. The princess was one step ahead. The plane was ready on the tarmac. The crew was waiting. She boarded the aircraft. The door closed. She took her seat. She opened the files on the bank manager. She knew who he was. She knew what he liked. She knew how to make him talk. She was going to break the bank. She was going to end the Queen's financial freedom. The engine started. The plane taxied toward the runway. She looked at the reflection in the window. She saw a woman who was no longer afraid of the crown. She saw a woman who knew that the future was hers. The plane took off. She watched the lights of the palace disappear below. She was in control. The sky was clear. The flight was short. She closed her eyes. She thought about the prince. He was the reason for this. She was doing this for his future. She would leave nothing to chance. She would clear the path for him. She was the mother of the king. She was the guardian of the new world. The bank in Switzerland was waiting. The final move was about to be made. The monarchy stands on the brink of a total transformation. With the official succession of Prince George, the exclusion of the Queen's children, and a secret financial pursuit now unfolding in Switzerland, the Princess of Wales has seized absolute control of the house. The Queen's legal challenge in Scotland may offer a final resistance, but the old guard has been purged and the new administration is already taking hold. As the stakes rise and international assets are locked in a high-stakes standoff, the future of the crown rests on a knife's edge.